The convoy hit the valley road at dawn. 3 trucks and a flatbed hauling what was left of Research Station Kellert through a landscape that had stopped being safe 11 days ago. Sergeant Ren Vasara was in the cab of the second truck, watching the fog peel back from the ridge above them. She had a broken collarbone strapped tight under her jacket and a bruise along her jaw that had gone from red to black to the particular yellow-green of something deciding whether it wanted to heal or not. She was 29 years old. She had not slept in 36 hours. The mountains out here on Harrow's Moon were the kind of beautiful that didn't care if you were alive to see it, stone gray and patient, scarred with old glaciers. She watched them anyway. "Sector 7's closed," said Preet from the driver's side. He had 2 fingers wrapped in med foam where the knuckle had split during the breach at Station Kellert. He drove with his wrists. Command pushed it through an hour ago. Quarantine perimeter is 40 clicks north now. They tell you why? They told me to relay the perimeter change. Vasara pressed her thumb along the edge of the collarbone brace, right where the pain lived. "Then we'll go around." "Ma'am, the pass around is—" "I know what it is." She pulled the map from the dash cradle and smoothed it against her knee. "We're doing it anyway." In the back of the truck, in the cargo section, with the equipment crates, was the woman they had pulled from Station Kellert. Vasara had looked at her twice since they loaded up. Once right after they found her, lying in the med bay, strapped to a table that had been bolted to the floor, still strapped, the table having partially torn free of its mounts at some point during whatever had happened there. Second time about 2 hours into the drive, when she'd gone back to check on the crates and found the woman awake, sitting upright on the folded-out bunk, watching the convoy dust drift past the rear vent slats. Her name was on the Kellert manifest. Ara Solis, Research Specialist, Xenobiology Division. The manifest had her as one of 41 personnel assigned to the station. They'd found 3 alive. Ara Solis was one. She hadn't yet explained what had happened to the other 38. She was dark-haired, quiet-eyed, calm, in a way that had no right to exist after whatever she'd been through. When Vasara had checked on her, Solis had said, "Is there water?" Vasara had given her the canteen from her belt. Solis had taken 3 careful sips, handed it back, and said, "Thank you." Then she'd lain back down and closed her eyes. That was all. Vasara had stood there for a moment, looking at the woman, the unmarked skin, the still face, the hands folded across her chest like someone sleeping on a long flight home, and felt something she didn't have a name for. Not threat assessment, not exactly. Something quieter, the kind of feeling you got when you realized you were missing information that mattered. She went back up front. Command had been calling it a gradient pathogen. GPs were a known risk in deep survey xenobiology, biological material from non-terrestrial organisms that, on contact with human genetic substrate, triggered a cascade of unwanted adaptation. Not infection exactly. The human body didn't go passive. It went active in the wrong direction, reorganizing itself around the contaminating biology, trying to interface, to integrate. The body wanted to survive. It didn't always know what that meant. Most GP events were minor. A rash, temperature dysregulation, neural interference that cleared in 48 hours with antivirals. The record showed 7 documented cases, over 40 years of colonial expansion. 6 of them had resolved without permanent sequelae. Kellert was not resolving. The tactical briefing Vasara had received 20 hours ago, a rushed thing, done over comms with a lot of static, and a major she'd never worked with before, had used phrases like cascade spread and behavioral modification and irreversible neurological rewrite. It had said that people who had been in contact with affected individuals showed secondary symptoms within hours. It had said that secondary carriers were dangerous. It had said that she should expect aggression. It had not said that the station would look the way it looked when they got there. The blood had been frozen solid in the corridors. That was the thing she kept coming back to. It had been cold enough on Harrow's Moon's dark side to freeze it before it could fully pool. So it had stayed where it was. On the walls, on the door frames, on the ceiling, in one corridor, where something had happened that she was not going to think about anymore. Patterns that told a story she didn't need completely told to understand the ending. 3 survivors, Ara Solis, strapped to a table in the med bay. A technician named Ver, who had barricaded herself in a supply closet on the station's upper level, and had been discovered by sound. The small scratching sound of her writing on the wall with a stylus because she had run out of handheld charge and hadn't wanted to stop recording, documenting what she'd seen station by station in handwriting that got smaller and smaller as the closet got colder. and a boy, maybe 20 years old, whom they'd found outside in the station's small vehicle bay, sitting in the driver's seat of a Rover with the engine running and the heat on, alive because of that detail, and nothing else. The boy was in the first truck. He hadn't said a word. He just sat with his hands on his knees and watched the road. Ver was in the third truck, lying down, sedated. The writing on the wall had been extensive. The medic had told Vasara what it described, and Vasara had asked him not to tell her again. The pass around Sector 7 added 4 hours to the drive. They climbed into terrain where the mountain pressed close on both sides, and the road was half obscured by old snow that had slid from the upper ridgeline and hadn't been cleared, because no one was clearing things out here anymore. Preet drove with focused care. The fog came back thicker up here, and the headlights caught it and turned it opaque and white, so it was like driving through the inside of something. Vasara was thinking about the table in the med bay, the bolt holes in the floor still clean, which meant the table had been installed recently, deliberately. Someone had anticipated the need to restrain a person in that room. Someone at Kellert had known something was coming that required preparation and had prepared for it, and the preparation had either worked or it hadn't. But either way, Ara Solis had been strapped to that table when they arrived, and Solis was alive, and the other 38 were not. She radioed the third truck. "Ver, still under? Yes, Sergeant. Don't bring her up until I give the word." She went back through the cargo section. The crates were stacked and strapped down along the left wall. Solis's bunk was on the right. Solis was awake, sitting up again with her feet on the floor, elbows on her knees. She looked up when Vasara came in, and something moved briefly in her face. Acknowledgement or assessment or both. "How long to the quarantine station?" Solis asked. 8 hours, give or take." Solis nodded. Her eyes dropped back to the floor. "Can you tell me what happened at Kellert?" Vasara said. A long pause. The truck rocked over a rough stretch of road, and the crates shifted with a sound like heavy breathing. "How much have they told you?" Solis asked. "Enough to know it started in xenobiology. Enough to know you were the division lead." Solis looked at her hands. She turned them over, palms up, as if checking something. The skin was smooth. No marks, no rash, no telltale coloration that Vasara had been briefed to watch for. "We were studying tissue samples from the survey recovered from Sector 12, Solis said. Non-terrestrial organic material. Preliminary analysis suggested it was dormant. The protocol called for a 3-day quarantine and then secondary exposure testing under controlled conditions." She paused. Dr. Marin decided the quarantine was unnecessary. He was the station director. He had that authority. And the samples weren't dormant, no. Solis's hands went still. They weren't dormant. Vasara waited. "The material responds to proximity," Solis said. "It doesn't need direct contact in the early stage. Within a certain range, it begins. It begins to interact with the body's systems. The immune system initially, then broader. It's not trying to destroy. It's trying to integrate. It uses the body as a scaffold, reshapes available biology to serve its own functions." She paused again, precise pauses, placed with care. "The people it reaches first become the mechanism by which it spreads to others. They don't lose consciousness. They don't stop being themselves, exactly. They just want something, need something. And the need is very strong. Blood," Vasara said. Solis looked at her. "The human circulatory system carries nutrients the material requires. It learns very quickly how to direct the body toward obtaining them. And the people in contact with them, the secondary carriers. Faster progression, less coherent." Solis's jaw tightened, almost imperceptible. Dr. Marin was among the first affected. He infected the medical team. The medical team infected the rest. She breathed through her nose. "I had time to prepare. I restrained myself before the progression reached the behavioral modification threshold. I didn't want to be a mechanism." Another pause, the longest one yet. "I didn't want to hurt anyone else." Vasara stood still in the middle of the cargo section. The convoy moved through the fog. Somewhere outside, the mountains were very tall and very quiet. She said, "Are you still infected, Doctor?" "Solis?" The woman who had strapped herself to a table so she wouldn't be able to hurt anyone looked up at her. "Yes," Solis said. "I think that's probably obvious." The quarantine station at Harrow's Reach was a prefab structure, 3 interlocked modules on a concrete pad, with a perimeter fence and a broadcast antenna, and a shuttle pad that had 2 military dropships on it and hadn't had commercial traffic in 9 days. There were soldiers at the gate, not militia, not local security. Colonial Defense Corps, full kit, rifles at low ready, the kind of posture that said they were authorized to use them. The convoy stopped at the outer checkpoint, and a man in a medical-grade hazsuit came to the cab window. He had a tablet and a list. Vasara, Sergeant Wren. Kellert Extraction Team. Vasara passed her ident card through the window. 3 survivors. 2 mobile, 1 sedated. One of them is still. She stopped, chose the next word carefully. One of them is still presenting. The man in the hazsuit looked at his tablet. He looked at her. The manifest said you were bringing equipment. We brought the survivors, too. Sergeant, protocol for active carrier extraction is. I know what the protocol is. She met his eyes through the faceplate. We're bringing all 3 survivors inside. I'll discuss the rest with your medical director. He went away for 7 minutes. She watched the timer on the dash. Pried drummed his fingers on the steering wheel with the 2 that still worked and said nothing. When the hazsuit man came back, he waved them through without speaking. They put Solus in a sealed containment room in Module 2. It had a cot, a chair, a small table, a viewport in the door, a panel set into the wall. The viewport had reinforced glass. The door had a biometric lock and a manual backup bolt that required 2 personnel to operate simultaneously. Standard protocol for gradient pathogen active carriers. Vasara stood on the outside of the viewport and watched Solus sit down on the cot. Solus looked at the room, at the walls, at the viewport. She found Vasara's eyes through the glass and held them a moment. Then she lay down, turned on her side, faced the wall, and was still. The medical director was a thin man named Colm, who had been a xenopathologist for 20 years and had the specific exhaustion of someone who had spent that time hoping never to be genuinely needed. He looked at Vasara's file and then at her, and then at the file again. You rode with her for 8 hours, he said. Yes, in close quarters. Cargo section. Yes. Sergeant, the proximity threshold for early-stage exposure. She told me she's still infectious. She told me that before I chose to stay in proximity. I made an informed decision. He set down the file. He looked like he wanted to ask several things and was restraining himself to the most important. Why? Vasara thought about the table. The bolt holes in the floor, freshly drilled. The woman who had tied herself down before the wanting got loud enough to make her dangerous. Who had sat in the cold and the dark of a dead station with 38 people's blood on the walls and done what she could to make sure she didn't add to the count. Because she made an informed decision too, Vasara said. And I thought someone should acknowledge that. Colm was quiet for a moment. Then, I'll need to begin exposure screening on you. Daily checks for the next week. I know. And you need to understand that if you show symptoms, I understand. She was already turning back toward the viewport. What are you going to do for her? He hesitated. The hesitation said enough. There's no treatment, Vasara said. It wasn't a question. The organic material is integrated into the host's biology at a fundamental level. He spread his hands, a gesture that somehow communicated both the enormity and the inadequacy. It's not attacking her. It's become part of her. Removing it would require, so you're going to keep her in there. We're going to try to understand it. The data she can provide, the tissue sampling, the behavioral documentation. She's not a data set. Vasara didn't raise her voice. She's the only person from Station Kellert who had the presence of mind to stop herself from infecting anyone else. She did that alone, in the cold. Strapped to a table, she bolted down herself. She finally looked away from the viewport. Treat her like that matters. 12 days into the quarantine, a second convoy arrived from the outer settlement at Dern's Crossing. 43 people, 3 of them showing early-stage behavioral markers, the rest exposed. The next day, a shuttle came in from the orbital platform with 11 more. The day after that, a militia vehicle from the southern agricultural settlements with 17 survivors, and a handwritten note from a local administrator that said simply, "We cannot contain this. Please send help." The quarantine station was built for 30. It now held 112. Vasara had been moved to a monitoring role because her daily screenings were still clean and someone needed to coordinate the overflow. She moved people, tracked exposures, relayed information upward to command, and received back instructions that grew increasingly abstract as the numbers grew. Maintain perimeter. Prioritize containment. Limit resource expenditure on confirmed carriers. She read that last one twice. Then she filed it without acknowledging it. She saw Solus through the viewport every day. Sometimes twice. Solus had been given research access, a terminal linked to the station's xenobiology database, limited outbound capability. After Colm determined that her cooperation was more valuable than his discomfort with the arrangement, she sat at the small table and worked. She ate when food was brought. She slept in short intervals. She didn't ask for things she couldn't have. One day she asked Vasara, through the comm panel, "The boy from the vehicle bay, is he all right?" Vasara had to think for a moment before she placed the reference. He hasn't spoken yet. But he's eating. He watches the perimeter cameras. I think he's counting the security rotations. He's smart, Solis said. He was an intern. He kept his head. A pause. "Tell him I said so." Vasara carried the message. The boy looked at her when she delivered it, really looked at her, for the first time, and for a moment something came into his face that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the direction of one. It was such a small thing. She thought about it for the rest of the day. 19 days in, Solis called her to the viewport in the middle of the night shift. Vasara was running on 4 hours of sleep and the sustained alertness that comes from the knowledge that the thing you're watching cannot be outrun by sleeping more. She came to the viewport and found Solis standing very close to the glass on the other side, which she didn't usually do. "I think I've found something," Solis said. Her voice was even. It was always even. But there was something underneath it. Not urgency, which would have been manageable, but the specific quality of a person who has just understood something they've been circling for a long time and are now deciding how to say it. "The material," Solis said, "the xenobiological component. It's not a pathogen in the way we've been modeling it. It doesn't replicate. It doesn't evolve to outcompete host biology. It integrates because that is its natural state. It requires a biological host to function at all. It's symbiotic. In its original environment, presumably with its original host species, the relationship was presumably mutually beneficial. But with humans, the integration destabilizes. The human body can sustain it, but the requirements, the nutritional requirements, the behavioral drives it generates, are incompatible with human social function. The material doesn't know that. It's doing what it evolved to do. It doesn't understand that the host species has limits." Vasara pressed her hand flat against the viewport glass, not quite thinking about it. On the other side of the glass, Solis looked at the hand. "What does this mean for treatment?" Vasara asked. "Possibly nothing. Possibly everything." Solis's jaw worked for a moment. If the material is symbiotic rather than parasitic, it may be possible to modify the interface, to establish a relationship the human body can sustain without. She stopped, started again. "Without the drives. Without the hunger. You're saying you could fix it. I'm saying it may be possible to reach a stable equilibrium. With the right substrate modification. With time." She paused. "I need to test it on a sample population, active carriers." Vasara looked at her through the glass. "You mean yourself?" "Myself first." "Yes. And if it doesn't work?" Solis looked back at her steadily. "Then it doesn't work. But, Sergeant, every day we don't try, more people are exposed. More people become mechanisms against their will." Something very small moved in her face. "I know what it's like to be that. I know what it costs to resist it. I would like to give other people the chance to resist it that I had. The preparation, the choice." The argument with Colm lasted 3 days. He was not wrong about the risks. She was not wrong about the alternative. These things can both be true at the same time and still require a decision. On the morning of the 4th day, Vasara walked into his office and set a copy of Command's latest transmission on his desk. The one that said, "Assess viability of controlled termination for confirmed long-duration carriers." She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. He looked at it for a long time. Then he said, "I'll need to oversee the trial personally." "Good," Vasara said. "That's what I'd want." The substrate modification took 11 days to develop. Solis directed it from inside the containment room via terminal, while Colm's team worked in the lab next to her cell. She would describe what she needed. They would formulate it. They would pass a sample through the containment slot. She would test it and report back. It was meticulous, and it was slow. And 3 times it produced results in her own biology that were alarming enough to pause everything while they assessed. Twice she wrote out the assessment period without comment. Once she said over the comm, with her eyes closed, "Give me 10 minutes, it'll stabilize." It did. The boy from the vehicle bay, his name was Tobin, they'd learned. Tobin Merrick, intern and 3rd-year biology student, had started spending time in the corridor outside the containment room. Not in it. In the corridor, sitting on the floor with his back to the wall, a tablet on his knees. Nobody told him to go away. He was quiet, attentive, and was starting to ask intelligent questions of anyone who walked past. Vasara gave him increasingly substantive ones to carry to Solis through the comm panel. It turned out to be efficient. He was in the corridor the morning Solus took the full iteration substrate. Vassara was there too. She'd been there since before dawn. They waited. The comm panel in the containment room was silent for 4 hours. Then Solus's voice came through. "Vitals are stable. I'm going to sleep. Can someone watch the monitoring?" "Already watching," Vassara said. Another silence. Then, "Thank you, Sergeant." It took 6 weeks from the first successful trial to the point where Command acknowledged it as a treatment protocol rather than a single data point. It took another 3 weeks for the first treated carrier to be assessed for reduced infectivity. It took 11 more days for Solus to pass her own clearance assessment. The morning she walked out of Module 2, Vassara was standing in the corridor. She had not orchestrated this. She had simply been doing her rounds, and it had happened to be her rounds when the medical team came to do the final check and then stepped aside and opened the door. Solus walked out. She stood in the corridor with its industrial lighting and its sounds of too many people in not enough space, and she breathed the air, which was recycled and not particularly fresh, and she looked at Vassara. "I need to re-register with Command," she said. "I assume they have records to update." "I assume so. And my research files should be archived properly. The methodology needs to be documented before anyone tries to replicate it and skip steps. I'll make sure you have access to a terminal." Solus nodded. Something was happening in her face that might have been, in a different person, in a different moment, something overwhelming. In Solus, it looked like a person who has been standing very still for a very long time and has now been told they can move. She said, "I want to check on Tobin. He's in the East module. He's been helping Colm's team." "Good." She said it simply, with warmth, the first open warmth Vassara had heard from her, the kind that comes loose when a person stops managing everything quite so tightly. "That's good." They walked down the corridor together. The station was full of noise and motion, patients, medics, the constant low hum of life support processing more air than it was designed for. Somewhere toward the north end, a group of people were having an argument about water rationing. Someone was laughing in the East module, the easy, helpless kind. The broadcast antenna on the roof was sending. And what it was sending now was different from what it had been sending 4 weeks ago, which was different from what it had been sending when the convoy arrived. It was sending, among other things, treatment protocol available, request coordination with regional medical authorities. This is transmittable. Vassara walked beside the woman who had strapped herself to a table in the dark and held herself still through the worst of it so she wouldn't become a mechanism for someone else's damage, who had then spent 6 weeks in a small white room finding a way out, not for herself first, for others, for the ones who hadn't had her preparation, who hadn't made it to the table in time, who hadn't had the chance to choose. Outside the quarantine station, the mountains of Harrow's moon went on being patient and gray and indifferent to whether any of this had happened. The fog was doing its morning thing on the valley floor. The snow on the ridge line was the particular color of something very old, and very cold, and very unbothered. In the East module, Tobin Merrick looked up from his tablet when the door opened. He saw Solus and went still for a moment the way very young people go still when something they've been holding a lot of weight for comes to resolution. Then he said, "Doctor." Solus, with the particular evenness of someone trying not to show how much they mean it, Solus said, "Show me what you've been working on." He did. She sat beside him, and they put their heads together over the terminal, and after a moment she pointed at something on the screen and said something too quiet for Vassara to catch, and Tobin nodded and started typing. Vassara stood in the doorway and watched them for a moment. Her collarbone was mostly healed. The bruise on her jaw was gone. She still wasn't sleeping enough, and probably wouldn't for a while, because the work was large, and they were not many, and the mountains outside didn't care. But the mountains didn't have to care. That wasn't the mountain's job. She pulled out her radio and called Pried. "How are the fingers?" she said. "Functional," he said. "Ugly, but functional. Good. I need you in Module 1. We're going to talk to Command about the next extraction site." A pause. "There are more?" "There are always more." She clicked off the radio and stood in the doorway a little longer, watching Solis and the boy who had survived by keeping the engine running and the heat on. Around them, the station breathed and argued and laughed and hummed. People making do with what they had, which was not everything, but was not nothing. It was, Vassara had come to think, enough to start with. She turned and walked back into the noise, carrying what she could carry, leaving the rest for morning.